Picture a snow-covered road in Belgium on Christmas Eve, 1944, and a German tank sitting dead in the frost, engine cold, fuel tanks empty, its crew long gone. Within months, that same machine would be lifted onto a ship, crossed an ocean, and arrived on American soil to be taken apart, piece by men who had never seen anything like it. You've heard about the tanks that fought in World War II. You've heard about the ones that burned on the beaches and froze in the forests. But almost nobody talks about what happened to the enemy's own machines once the guns went silent. The ones that didn't get scrapped, didn't get melted down, didn't disappear into some forgotten field. Some of them were shipped straight into the heart of America, to a quiet patch of Maryland farmland, where the United States Army wanted answers. What made German armor so terrifying? What made it so flawed? And what America could steal from its enemy's engineering to build the tanks of tomorrow? This is the story of the captured German tanks that crossed the Atlantic, and the strange, slow, half-forgotten fate that awaited them once they got here. To understand why any of this mattered, you have to understand how badly the United States had underestimated German tank design going into the war. American tank doctrine in the early 1940s was built around speed, reliability, and mass production. The Sherman tank above all else, a machine designed to be built by the thousands in factories from Michigan to California. It was dependable, it was easy to repair, and when it met a panther or a tiger in open country, it was often outgunned and out-armored in ways that cost American crews their lives. The Germans had built machines around a different philosophy entirely: thicker sloped armor, longer high-velocity cannons, interleaved road wheels for a smoother ride over rough terrain. Reports came back from the front describing Sherman crews needing to disable a single Tiger with 4 or 5 shots just to have a chance, sometimes flanking it, sometimes simply avoiding it altogether. Every intelligence officer in the European theater wanted the same thing: an intact example of the enemy's best machines, something that could be measured, tested, and understood rather than just feared from a distance. The Army's Ordnance Department had a facility built exactly for this kind of work, established back in 1917 during the previous World War, sprawling across the Maryland coastline at a place called Aberdeen Proving Ground. It had been quietly gathering foreign weapons and vehicles for evaluation since before America even entered the war. Now, with German armor rolling across Europe proving far more dangerous than anticipated, one goal became urgent above all others: get a Tiger back to Aberdeen, in one piece, by any means necessary. What nobody in Washington expected was just how difficult and how strange that mission would turn out to be. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had reached its most brutal and confused phase. The German offensive through the Ardennes forest, what would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, had caught American forces off guard, and amid the chaos of retreating lines and frozen roads, something rare happened. On December 24, 1944, near the small Belgian town of Koo, a Sherman tank crew from the 744th Tank Battalion, under the command of a sergeant named Jim George, engaged and disabled a German King Tiger, the newest and most heavily armored tank in the entire German arsenal, so new that fewer than 50 had even been built. The tank, marked with the turret number 332, ran out of fuel and was abandoned by its crew rather than destroyed. For the American command, this was close to a miracle. Every previous attempt to capture a King Tiger intact had ended with the Germans blowing the vehicle apart before it could fall into enemy hands. This one hadn't been destroyed. It had simply been left. Word moved up the chain almost immediately. Colonel Wilson Rubel, upon hearing the tank was sitting undamaged near Koo, gave the order that would define the machine's next chapter: get it back to Aberdeen. The 463rd Ordnance Evacuation Company was sent to retrieve it, loaded it onto a railway flatbed, and moved it toward the port city of Antwerp. There, in the middle of a war that was still very much being fought, Tank 332 was hoisted onto a cargo ship bound for the United States. It's worth pausing on how strange that image really is. While American soldiers were still fighting and dying in the Ardennes, one of the most feared weapons of that same battle was already crossing the Atlantic in the belly of a supply ship, headed toward a research facility where its secrets would be picked apart in complete safety. It would be the only intact King Tiger to ever reach American shores. But its journey across the ocean was only the beginning of its story, and the years that followed would treat it far stranger than anyone climbing aboard that ship in Antwerp could have imagined. Back in Washington and at Aberdeen itself, the arrival of an intact King Tiger sparked something close to a full engineering emergency, in the best possible sense. Ordnance officers, metallurgists, and engineers descended on the vehicle almost the moment it touched American soil. This wasn't simple curiosity. Every angle of the armor plating was measured, every weld was inspected. The gun, a devastating 88mm cannon capable of punching through nearly any Allied tank at ranges American guns couldn't match, was studied barrel to breech. Aberdeen wasn't a museum at this stage. It was closer to an operating theater, a facility whose entire purpose was to strip enemy weapons of their mystery. And Tank 332 wasn't traveling alone. Throughout the war, other German vehicles had made the same crossing, a Panther here, an early Tiger there, eventually joined by one of the largest and strangest armored vehicles Germany ever fielded, the Ferdinand tank destroyer, a lumbering fortress on tracks built around a massive fixed casemate gun, so heavy it had famously struggled with mechanical reliability on the Eastern Front. Each of these vehicles carried lessons the army was desperate to learn. Engineers found that German armor, while thick and well-sloped, was in some cases more brittle than American steel, prone to cracking under repeated impact in ways smoother, more ductile American armor resisted. They found that the complex interleaved road wheel suspension systems, brilliant on paper for distributing weight and softening the ride, were an absolute nightmare to maintain in the field, requiring entire outer wheels to be removed just to replace a single inner one, a design flaw that mattered far less in a controlled proving ground than it did for a maintenance crew under artillery fire. Quietly, engineers began weaving pieces of what they learned into future American designs, some as small refinements to suspension components, others feeding into concepts that would take years to reach production. It's a strange kind of irony that some of the machines built to kill American soldiers ended up, piece by piece, improving the machines meant to protect them. But not every foreign vehicle at Aberdeen had arrived as a spoil of war, and one story sitting quietly alongside all this captured German steel reveals something almost nobody expects. Not every tank parked in the fields of Aberdeen had been dragged there against its will. Starting in 1942 and again in 1943, the Soviet Union sent examples of its own frontline armor to the United States, a T-34 and a KV-1 heavy tank among them, not as trophies, but as a gesture of wartime cooperation between allies, part of the strange, uneasy partnership between Washington and Moscow against a common enemy. American engineers ran these Soviet machines through the exact same battery of tests as the captured German vehicles, and what came back was almost as surprising as anything learned from the Tiger. A Soviet intelligence report, later obtained by a GRU operative monitoring the American evaluation, revealed the results were mixed in ways that flattered nobody completely. American testers found the T-34's diesel engine failed after just a few hundred kilometers of hard use, and were blunt about the tank's rough manufacturing quality. But the same report noted something almost begrudging in its respect. American engineers openly admired the shape and sloped armor of the Soviet tank, and privately acknowledged that despite its rougher construction, the T-34's combination of armor, firepower, and mobility outperformed anything comparable the United States had built. Imagine that for a moment. In the same fields where Germany's most feared armor was being dismantled for its secrets, a Soviet ally's tank was sitting nearby, earning grudging respect from the same engineers, All of it happening in near total secrecy, invisible to the public and largely forgotten until archived documents surfaced decades later. Aberdeen, it turns out, wasn't just where America studied its enemies. It was where America quietly discovered it might be behind its own allies, too. And once the war ended entirely, the question of what to do with all of it, German, Soviet, everything, became a problem nobody in Washington had really planned for. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Aberdeen Proving Ground didn't stop growing, it exploded. Captured vehicles that had trickled in throughout the war now arrived by the shipload, entire collections of German, Italian, and Japanese equipment gathered from battlefields across 3 continents and funneled back to Maryland for study, storage, or eventual disposal. What had once been a careful, purpose-driven evaluation program turned into something closer to an overflowing warehouse of the world's most dangerous machinery, with nowhere near enough space or funding to properly care for any of it. The solution the Army landed on was almost shockingly simple, and it would define the fate of these vehicles for the next 60 years. They lined them up outdoors, along the 1.5-mile entry road leading to the Ordnance Museum, tank after tank, German, American, Soviet, side by side in the open Maryland weather, a corridor that visitors and collectors came to call the Mile of Tanks. For decades, anyone driving toward the museum for the annual military vehicle rally passed directly through this open-air graveyard of steel, a rolling, rusting timeline of 20th century warfare parked in a median strip. It sounds almost unbelievable now that a captured King Tiger, one of the rarest surviving examples of Nazi Germany's most feared weapon, spent roughly 40 years sitting outside, unprotected from rain, snow, and the salt air rolling in off the Chesapeake, slowly being eaten alive by rust. Paint peeled, steel corroded, components seized. The very machine that had terrified American tank crews in the Ardennes forest was now quietly disintegrating in a Maryland parking median, and almost nobody outside a small circle of collectors and historians seemed to notice or care. But the story of what finally happened to these tanks, and why they vanished from public view entirely, is stranger still, and it connects directly to one of the most consequential days in American history. For decades, the deterioration continued largely unchecked, a slow-motion tragedy playing out in plain sight to anyone who bothered to look closely at the Mile of Tanks. Eventually, some of the vehicles were pulled out for restoration, Tank 332 among them, eventually transferred to the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox, where restorers did something almost theatrical, slicing away an entire side panel of the hull and turret to expose the tank's inner mechanisms to public view, repainting it in accurate wartime colors, giving visitors a literal window into the machine that had once terrified an army. But most of the collection wasn't so lucky, and the facility itself was living on borrowed time. Then came September 11th, 2001, and in the years that followed, security concerns swept across American military installations in ways that reshaped facilities that had stood largely unchanged for generations. Aberdeen Proving Ground, an active Army research base, found itself increasingly incompatible with hosting a public museum and public rallies inside its perimeter. In 2010, the museum closed its doors, and the decision was made to relocate the entire collection. Hundreds of historic vehicles, including that same King Tiger, the Ferdinand, Soviet armor, experimental American prototypes that never saw combat, to a new facility at Fort Lee, Virginia. Before the move, engineers gave many of the neglected vehicles emergency treatment, draining fluids, blasting away decades of rust and paint under tens of thousands of pounds of water pressure, repainting exteriors to arrest further decay, even if it couldn't undo what 40 years of Maryland winters had already done. And here is the twist almost nobody outside the collector community knows. Because of a congressional restriction on using military construction funds for museum buildings, The new facility at Fort Lee is legally classified not as a museum, but as a training asset, the Ordnance Training Support Facility. It is not open to the public. Parking near the building is deliberately limited to prevent it from functioning as a de facto museum. One of the only intact King Tiger tanks in the world, along with an irreplaceable collection of captured and Allied wartime armor, now sits behind a fence, safe from the elements at last, but essentially invisible to the very public whose curiosity built the collection in the first place. There's something almost poetic and deeply unsettling about how this story ends. A tank captured under fire on a frozen Belgian road, shipped across a war-torn ocean to be studied for the secrets that might save American lives, spent the next 4 decades quietly rotting in the open air of a Maryland median strip, largely ignored, before finally being rescued only to disappear behind the closed doors of a base most Americans will never set foot on. The lessons those engineers pulled from German armor plating and Soviet suspension systems didn't just vanish, they filtered quietly into decades of American tank design, an invisible inheritance passed down through generations of engineers who likely never knew where the ideas originally came from. Modern armored vehicle design still wrestles with the same fundamental trade-offs those wartime engineers were racing to understand: protection against mobility, complexity against reliability, firepower against survivability. Every time a modern tank crew climbs into an Abrams at that same Aberdeen proving ground where Tank 332 was once torn apart for its secrets, they're standing on ground shaped, in some small, unacknowledged way, by the machines their grandfather's generation captured on the battlefields of a war that ended 80 years ago. So here's a question worth sitting with. How many other pieces of history are sitting right now behind some fence, some warehouse, some facility nobody thinks to ask about, quietly rotting or quietly preserved, completely invisible until someone decides to go looking? If you found this one surprising, wait until you hear what happened to the equipment America never even bothered shipping home at all. If you want that story, make sure you're subscribed because it's coming next and it's even stranger than this one.